The night Moises Mendoza was executed, the echoes of his final words reverberated through the chambers of death row. The man who had once shown promise, whose life took a dark turn, now faced the irreversible consequence of his actions. It was a chilling reminder of the weight that one decision, a single moment of violence, could carry for a lifetime. But the question remains, what drives a man to commit such horrors? What makes someone go from an ordinary life to one so marred by violence that even his final moments became a testament to his brutality? For Rachelle Tolleson, a young woman with so much life ahead of her, the answer came too late. Her life was stolen, her dreams shattered in an instant, and the justice she deserved would come only after years of suffering, both for her family and the community. On a quiet night in 2004, Moises Mendoza entered her home. What happened next would leave a mother devastated, a community torn apart, and a man sitting in a cell haunted by his own actions. Mendoza's life, once full of potential, had led to this tragic conclusion. A death sentence for a crime so violent, so cold, it would forever change the lives of those left behind. This is the story of Moises Mendoza, a man whose actions would end in the ultimate punishment, and the woman whose life was tragically stolen in the process. Today, we will walk through the crime, the investigation, the trial, and the aftermath, as we search for understanding in a story that is both heart-wrenching and unforgettable. Moises Mendoza, a man born into a family that once held hope for a bright future, found himself caught in a web of poor choices and uncontrollable anger. His descent into violence was not a sudden shift, but a series of escalating behaviors that pushed him farther from redemption. At the time of his arrest, Mendoza was facing the consequences of a long history of crimes, each more severe than the last. But nothing could have prepared the world for the brutal murder of Rachelle Tolleson. The community in Farmersville, Texas, where Rachelle lived, was rocked by the sudden and violent end to her life. A young mother with her whole future ahead of her was gone in the blink of an eye, and the question that plagued everyone was, why? Why did Mendoza, a man who once seemed like a regular guy, commit such a shocking crime? The answer lies in a mix of history, circumstances, and a fatal meeting between two lives that were destined to intersect in the most tragic of ways. For Rachelle's family, the pain of her loss would never fully fade, even as justice was served. The toll of this crime went far beyond the physical act of murder. It stretched into the emotional and psychological wounds that would forever scar her loved ones. Her mother, in particular, would spend years seeking closure and understanding, grappling with the unanswered questions that come with losing a child in such a senseless manner. Mendoza's execution was not just the end of his life, but the final chapter of a dark and tragic story that had gripped the hearts of so many. But even after the gavel fell, and the state ended his life, the story didn't truly end. It became a lesson, a cautionary tale of how violence, when left unchecked, consumes everything in its path. For some, it was the closure they desperately needed. For others, it was a bitter reminder of the lives that were irrevocably lost. Moises Mendoza was born on January 26, 1984, in Mexico, but his family's search for a better life soon brought them to the United States. They settled in northern Texas, where Mendoza grew up, and his early years appeared to follow a familiar pattern for a young boy with hopes of making something of himself. He was described as a friendly and energetic child, someone who often excelled in school and had a knack for making friends. His potential seemed endless. Raised in a household with two siblings and hard-working parents, Mendoza had the foundation to build a solid future. His mother, a caring but stern figure, instilled the importance of education and respect for others. His father, a man who worked long hours to provide for the family, set an example of perseverance. It was a life that many might have envied, stable, supportive, and full of opportunity. But somewhere along the way, something went wrong. Mendoza's teenage years marked the beginning of his slow shift toward trouble. Though he was often seen hanging out with friends and engaging in social activities, his attitude began to change. Teachers noticed that he struggled with authority and had a growing resistance to discipline. By the time he was in high school, it was clear that he was no longer the promising young man he once was. His rebellious behavior worsened, and incidents of petty theft, bullying, and even violent outbursts began to surface. One of the most significant red flags came when Mendoza dropped out of high school in his senior year. The dream of a brighter future seemed to slip further out of reach. While his peers graduated and moved on to college or jobs, Mendoza found himself without direction, bouncing from job to job with little to no commitment to his work. His actions began to show signs of a man unable or unwilling to handle the pressures of adult responsibility. Despite these early signs, Mendoza's family continued to hope for a change. His mother still tried to guide him, encouraging him to settle into a trade or continue his education, but these efforts were met with indifference. The promise of a better life that had seemed so tangible in his childhood had now become an abstract dream, a dream that Mendoza no longer seemed capable of pursuing. It was during this period of uncertainty that Mendoza's life would intersect with the violent crime that would change everything. The anger that had simmered beneath the surface for years would eventually find its outlet in a tragic and horrific act. But before that moment arrived, Mendoza's story was one of lost potential and the undeniable signs of a man whose path was already beginning to veer dangerously off course. Have you ever known someone who had so much potential but seemed to lose their way? Someone who started strong but got caught up in choices that led them down a darker path? Let me know in the comments. March 18, 2004. Started like any other day in the quiet town of Farmersville, Texas. But for 20-year-old Rachelle Tolleson, it would mark the beginning of a terrifying and tragic turn in her life. That night, as she prepared to spend an evening alone in her small home, little did she know that her life was about to be cut short in a way no one could have imagined. Rachelle, a young mother to a 6-month-old daughter, Avery, was no stranger to hard work and dedication. She had her whole future ahead of her, a future that included dreams of raising her daughter in a safe and loving environment. But those dreams were shattered when Moises Mendoza, someone she had known in passing, appeared at her doorstep. The encounter was not coincidental. Mendoza, who had spent years building up a disturbing history of violence, had been lingering in the shadows of his own mind, feeding on anger and resentment. He knew Rachelle, though not well, and his intentions were anything but innocent. On that fateful night, Mendoza gained entry into her home through an unlocked back door. What began as a brief visit would soon spiral into something far more horrifying. Once inside, Mendoza confronted Rachelle. What transpired in those early moments remains largely speculative, but the brutality of what followed was undeniable. Mendoza, in a fit of rage, sexually assaulted her and then proceeded to strangle her. But that wasn't enough. In a final act of violence, he brutally stabbed her in the throat, ending her life in a secluded corner of her own home. Afterward, he took steps to conceal his crime. He tried to burn Rachelle's body in an attempt to erase the evidence of his unspeakable actions, but even this wasn't enough to cover up what he had done. When the police eventually found her remains 6 days later, it was clear that Rachelle had met a violent, untimely end. The discovery of her body sent shockwaves through the community. Friends and family who had known Rachelle couldn't understand how something so horrific could happen in their small, seemingly peaceful town. How could someone with the appearance of a regular man, Mendoza, be capable of such violence? And what could have driven him to commit such an unimaginable act? What made the situation even more terrifying was the cold, calculated nature of Mendoza's actions. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was the culmination of years of violent tendencies and deeply troubling behavior that had been building in the background of his life. Rachelle's murder was not just a random act of violence. It was a reflection of the darkness that had taken root in Mendoza's heart over the years. Mendoza's motivations remained unclear, but the brutal violence of the crime spoke for itself. What seemed like a senseless and brutal killing would soon unfold into a case that would capture the attention of the entire community, and eventually, the nation. As investigators started piecing together the events leading to Rachelle's death, they would come to discover a chilling truth. Moises Mendoza was not only responsible for her murder, but had also committed similar violent acts in the past. The search for Rachelle Tolleson's killer began the moment her body was discovered on March 24, 2004. The small community of Farmersville, Texas, was in shock. A young mother had been brutally murdered and no one could understand why or how. The initial investigation was filled with uncertainty. There were no immediate suspects, and the lack of physical evidence at the crime scene left authorities struggling to piece together what had happened. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A friend of Moises Mendoza's, who had known him for years, became concerned when Mendoza confessed to him. In a chilling admission, Mendoza revealed that he had killed Rachelle and tried to burn her body to hide his crime. The friend, disturbed by the confession, immediately contacted law enforcement, which led to Mendoza's arrest. Authorities quickly moved to arrest Mendoza, who, up until that point, had not been on their radar. When questioned, Mendoza initially denied involvement, but the police had already gathered enough evidence to move forward with charges. The tip-off from Mendoza's friend, combined with physical evidence that eventually linked him to the crime scene, sealed his fate. During the investigation, detectives discovered disturbing details about Mendoza's past. His violent tendencies were not a one-time occurrence. They had been building over the years. Investigators unearthed reports of incidents where Mendoza had been involved in violent altercations, including assaults on family members and a history of trouble with the law. These revelations painted a dark picture of a man who had been on the brink of something catastrophic for quite some time. Further investigation revealed that Mendoza had been under the radar for years, his violent behaviors ignored or overlooked by those around him. The connection between his violent history and the brutal murder of Rachelle Tolleson became impossible to ignore. It was clear that Mendoza had been living a double life, one that was hidden behind a facade of normalcy until it eventually exploded in the most horrific of ways. On April 7, 2004, Moises Mendoza was formally charged with the capital murder of Rachelle Tolleson. His arrest, while expected, sent a wave of relief through the community. But even as he was led away in handcuffs, the bigger question remained. Why? What could have possibly driven a man to take the life of a young mother with so much promise? The investigation had only just begun, but one thing was clear. Mendoza's crime was not just a random act of violence. It was the product of years of deeply rooted anger and unchecked rage. Moises Mendoza's trial for the capital murder of Rachelle Tolleson began in the summer of 2005. The case had already captivated the public's attention due to the brutal nature of the crime and Mendoza's unsettling history of violence. His actions on the night of Rachelle's murder shocked not only her family and community but the entire nation. The courtroom, filled with anxious spectators, was poised for a trial that would determine Mendoza's fate. The prosecution wasted no time in presenting a clear and compelling case. They argued that Mendoza's brutal crime was not an act of passion, but a cold, calculated murder. Their evidence was overwhelming. In addition to the confession made by Mendoza's friend, physical evidence at the crime scene, including DNA found on Rachelle's body, directly linked him to the murder. The prosecutors painted a chilling picture of a man who had planned and executed the crime with chilling precision. They argued that Mendoza had targeted Rachelle, not because of a personal vendetta, but because of an impulse driven by rage and uncontrollable violence. The defense, on the other hand, attempted to argue that Mendoza was not fully responsible for his actions due to his troubled upbringing and history of emotional instability. A clinical psychologist took the stand to testify that Mendoza had a history of emotional immaturity and that his violent tendencies had been present for years. The defense attempted to portray him as a man unable to control his impulses due to a lifetime of struggles with mental health and family dynamics. Despite this argument, the prosecution's case proved too strong. They argued that Mendoza's repeated violent outbursts, his attempts to conceal the crime, and his cold demeanor after the murder were clear signs that he was fully aware of what he had done. There was no indication that he was incapable of understanding the severity of his actions. He had been in control the entire time. The jury deliberated for several days before returning a unanimous verdict of guilty for the capital murder of Rachelle Tolleson. The decision was met with a mixture of relief and sadness. While many believed that Mendoza had received the justice he deserved, the weight of the crime still loomed heavily. Rachelle's family, though grateful for the conviction, could never fully heal from the loss of their daughter and mother. In the sentencing phase of the trial, the prosecution sought the death penalty. They argued that Mendoza's history of violence, his complete lack of remorse, and the brutality of the murder made him a clear candidate for the ultimate punishment. The defense, however, pleaded for mercy, citing Mendoza's troubled background and his claims of remorse for his actions. But the jury was unmoved. On June 29, 2005, Moises Mendoza was sentenced to death for the capital murder of Rachelle Tolleson. For Rachelle's family, the trial and conviction brought a sense of closure, though it was bittersweet. No verdict or sentence could bring back their loved one, but they had fought for justice and had been heard. The trial was a grim reminder of the violence that lurks in the hearts of some individuals and the irreversible impact it can have on innocent lives. After being sentenced to death in 2005, Moises Mendoza's legal journey did not end with the verdict. Like many death row inmates, he filed multiple appeals in an effort to reverse his conviction or delay his execution. His legal team claimed that Mendoza had been denied effective counsel during his original trial and that new evidence could potentially exonerate him, or, at the very least, reduce his sentence. One of Mendoza's primary arguments was that the prosecution had relied too heavily on the testimony of the clinical psychologist who claimed Mendoza's violent tendencies were a result of emotional immaturity. His defense team argued that this expert's testimony was flawed, painting an incomplete picture of Mendoza's mental state and undermining his ability to control his actions. Despite these claims, the courts repeatedly upheld Mendoza's conviction, with judges finding no significant evidence to warrant a new trial or a reduction in his sentence. In 2011, Mendoza's team filed for a stay of execution, citing issues with his health and mental state. They argued that Mendoza was suffering from severe depression and anxiety, which, they claimed, rendered him unfit for execution. The legal process dragged on as these appeals were reviewed, but each request for a delay was ultimately denied. The state of Texas, resolute in its position, refused to halt Mendoza's execution, citing the overwhelming nature of his crimes and the conclusion that he had been in full control of his actions during the murder. In 2024, Mendoza made a final attempt for clemency. He expressed deep remorse for his actions, hoping to secure mercy from the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles. Mendoza's request included a plea for a life sentence instead of the death penalty, citing his time on death row as a period of reflection and transformation. However, this final request was met with resistance from the victims' families, who felt that no amount of remorse could undo the pain Mendoza had caused. In a last-ditch effort, Mendoza's legal team appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, but in April 2025, the court denied their petition, marking the final rejection of Mendoza's appeals. With no remaining legal recourse, Mendoza's execution was set for April 23, 2025. April 23, 2025, was the day that Moises Mendoza's life came to a grim conclusion. For years, he had been confined to death row, awaiting the inevitable date when his fate would be sealed. It was a date that brought mixed feelings to many. Some felt a sense of closure, while others were left questioning the finality of the death penalty. Mendoza's execution by lethal injection took place at the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville, one of the most notorious execution sites in the United States. The atmosphere surrounding his execution was heavy, with both his supporters and the victims' family members present, waiting for the end of a chapter that had begun more than 2 decades earlier. Rachelle Tolleson's family, having waited for justice all these years, found themselves standing on the other side of the law, watching as the man responsible for their daughter's death prepared to pay for his crime. As the procedure began, Mendoza remained calm, his demeanor cold and collected. This was not the same man who had appeared broken and remorseful in his final appeals. The years on death row had done little to change him. When given the opportunity to speak, Mendoza offered his final words, a brief statement of apology. "I am sorry for having robbed you of Rachelle's life. I know nothing that I could ever say or do would ever make up for that. I want you to know I am sincere. I apologize." Mendoza turned to his own family, offering them his love and saying, "I love you, I am with you, I am well and at peace." It was a quiet, almost detached expression of regret. There were no dramatic pleas for mercy, no final protests of innocence. His words, though brief, reflected the gravity of the situation, the end of a life and the closure for a family who had been devastated by his actions. Rachelle Tolleson's family, including her mother, Pam O'Neill, watched from the witness room. While they didn't speak publicly about their feelings in the immediate aftermath, their grief was clear. For them, this was not just the end of Mendoza's life. It was the end of a long, painful journey filled with unanswered questions and enduring heartache. The lethal injection was administered, and moments later, Mendoza was pronounced dead at 6:01 p.m. His execution marked the conclusion of one of Texas's most controversial death row cases. For many, it was the justice they had waited for. For others, it was a reminder of the complexity of the justice system and the finality of the death penalty. As Moises Mendoza's execution came to an end, one thing remained undeniably clear. The ripple effects of his actions would never fade for those left behind. For Rachelle Tolleson's family, the pain of losing their daughter, sister, and mother could never be truly erased. The gavel that sealed Mendoza's fate might have brought legal closure, but the emotional scars left on Rachelle's loved ones would linger forever. But what about us, the viewers? The ones who sit behind screens watching lives like Rachelle's get cut short, experiencing the tragedy from a distance. Is it enough to simply watch and move on to the next video? Or should we be asking ourselves deeper questions? How many stories like Rachelle's will we scroll past only to forget by the time we click on the next link? What does it take for us to feel the weight of what happened, not just as passive spectators, but as active participants in understanding these events, discussing them, and reflecting on their impact? Have you ever wondered how the life of someone like Mendoza, who showed promise in his youth, could spiral into something so devastating? What could have been done to stop it before it escalated into a tragedy? And most importantly, who are we as a society, knowing that lives like Rachelle's are taken, that families are destroyed, and we still allow these stories to fade into the background? The justice served in this case might give a sense of closure, but does it really fix the broken pieces of those affected? Does it heal the hearts of a mother who will never get to hold her daughter again, or a child who will grow up never knowing her mother? As we reflect on the consequences of Mendoza's actions, I ask you, what is the real cost of violence? How much responsibility do we, as a society, bear in the tragedies that unfold around us? Think about it. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Should justice be defined by the execution of a criminal, or is there more we can do to prevent such crimes in the first place? Like this video if you believe that justice isn't just about punishment, but about understanding the roots of such violence. Share with your friends, and let's get a conversation going about how we can change things. Subscribe for more true crime stories that challenge how we think about justice, society, and the lives affected.